For decades, the world has been told one version of Michael Jackson's story, a narrative carefully crafted, heavily filtered, and ultimately incomplete. Hollywood's machine has spent billions controlling the image, the narrative, and the truth. But what if everything you thought you knew was missing crucial context? What if the real Michael Jackson, the man behind the glove, beyond the moonwalk, deeper than the contested accusations, was systematically misrepresented by those with agendas to serve? This isn't just another documentary. This is another biopic designed to make you cry or shock you into compliance with whatever agenda the studio executives decided would sell tickets. This is the story that kept Hollywood's boardrooms in heated debate for decades. The truth that challenged narratives, exposed inconsistencies, and demanded critical examination of how allegations are investigated, reported, and weaponized in the court of public opinion. Michael Jackson wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just a dancer. He wasn't even just a cultural phenomena. He was a revolutionary force, a man who understood the power of media, the influence of art, and the responsibility that came with a platform that could reach billions. He was a man who tried to change the world through his music, his vision, and his genuine commitment to humanitarian causes, work that deserves acknowledgement even as we examine the full complexity of his life. But here is what the mainstream narrative failed to do. It failed to distinguish between allegations and proof. It failed to separate speculation from evidence. It failed to honor the presumption of innocence that should apply to anyone facing accusations. Michael Jackson faced serious allegations. That's a documented fact, but he was also acquitted on all criminal charges when tried in court. That's also a documented fact. And the mainstream media's inability to accurately represent both truths reveals something important about how narratives are constructed and controlled. For years, we watched as his legacy was debated piece by piece. We saw documentaries funded by networks present one perspective without adequate counter-evidence. We witnessed accusations that were never criminally proven, amplified alongside dismissal of contradicting testimony and evidence. We observed as his music was subjected to cultural reckonings that applied standards inconsistently across the industry. We've watched as a complex human being, flawed, certainly, but also brilliant and generous, was reduced to a simplified narrative that served specific interests. The question isn't whether Michael Jackson was guilty or innocent. The real question is, why did the world's most powerful media institutions fail to investigate thoroughly, failed to present complete information, and failed to maintain journalistic standards when covering one of the biggest stories of our time? In 2026, one filmmaker decided to do what mainstream media should have done: investigate thoroughly, to examine court records, to research timelines carefully, to interview people on all sides of the story, to follow the evidence, not the headlines, to understand not just what happened, but why certain narratives were promoted while others were suppressed. What emerged wasn't vindication or condemnation. It was complexity. It was nuns. It was the reality that Michael Jackson was simultaneously a humanitarian who genuinely cared about children's welfare and a deeply troubled individual with inappropriate relationships and poor judgment. It was the understanding that the truth is rarely as simple as either the accusers or the defenders wanted to present. It was the recognition that media narratives often serve interests that have nothing to do with actual truth-seeking. This is the story of one of the greatest artists who ever lived, examined with intellectual honesty. This is the account of how media narratives are constructed and controlled. This is the documentary that explains why the full story is more important than any simplified version. This is the opportunity to understand Michael Jackson, all of him, not the curated version on through him. To understand how power, media, and narrative control shape our collective understanding of reality. You've never seen this version before, and once you do, you'll understand why complete, honest storytelling is so rare in an industry built on simplified narratives. The truth was always there. It was just waiting for someone willing to present it with integrity. The rise of Michael Jackson wasn't accidental. It was engineered. From the moment he stepped onto a stage as a child, every element of his career was meticulously orchestrated by people who understood something fundamental about the entertainment industry. Control the narrative, and you control the market. Michael Jackson was a predacious child with an adult's artistic vision, a teenager with the work ethic of a seasoned professional, and a young man who would eventually gain significant creative control over his work. But his path was shaped by forces far larger than any individual talent. The Jackson 5 didn't just become famous. They were developed into superstars by Joe Jackson, their father and manager, whose methods were harsh and controversial by any standard past or present. He was a strict disciplinarian who understood that the entertainment industry demanded absolute professionalism, whether one agrees with his methods or not. The Jackson 5 became the biggest phenomenon of their era through relentless preparation, obsessive training, and management that refused to accept anything less than excellence. This is not to justify harsh parenting practices, but to acknowledge the strategic understanding that Joe Jackson possessed about entertainment as an industry. Young Michael was the standout talent. His voice was extraordinary. His dancing was revolutionary. His instincts were impeccable. He studied the masters James Brown, Fred Astaire, Jackie Wilson, and synthesized their techniques into something entirely new. While other child stars were playing, Michael Jackson was building the technical and artistic foundation that would eventually make him the most influential entertainer of his generation. The work ethic was genuine. The talent was undeniable. The vision was clear. By the late 1970s, Michael Jackson was already emerging as a solo artist. His albums were breaking records. His singles were dominating radio. His performances were setting new standards. But what industry insiders understood was that Michael Jackson represented something unprecedented. Not just commercial potential, but genuine artistic innovation that could influence global culture. This kind of power attracts attention, both positive and complex. Thriller, released in 1982, was a watershed moment. The album spent 37 weeks at #1 and became the best-selling album of all time, with over 75 million copies sold worldwide. The music video revolutionized the medium. The cultural impact was undeniable. But this level of dominance also triggered something important. The recognition that Michael Jackson had become more than an entertainer. He had become a cultural force whose influence extended beyond music into fashion, dance, visual art, and social consciousness. This kind of reach is uncommon, and uncommon power always attracts scrutiny. Throughout the 1980s, Michael Jackson was also emerging as a humanitarian. He supported numerous charities. He funded children's hospitals. He advocated for environmental causes and international peace initiatives. We Are the World, recorded with other major artists, raised millions for famine relief in Africa. His humanitarian work was genuine and extensive, though it received less media attention than his commercial success. This combination, extraordinary artistic talent plus significant humanitarian commitment plus massive global influence, created a profile that was unique in entertainment history. By the end of the 1980s, Michael Jackson had achieved something that very few artists accomplish: complete creative autonomy. He had negotiated deals that gave him control over his music, his image, and his artistic direction. He owned stakes in his catalog. He had leveraged that very few entertainers possessed. This autonomy was hard-won and represented his resistance to the traditional power structures of the entertainment industry. He had fought to maintain creative control, and he had succeeded. But this success came with consequences that would become increasingly apparent as the 1990s unfolded. The 1990s marked a profound shift in how Michael Jackson was covered by mainstream media. In 1993, a 13-year-old boy and his family made allegations of sexual abuse against Michael Jackson. These allegations were serious and were investigated by authorities. However, no criminal charges were ever filed. Instead, a civil settlement was reached between the families involved and Jackson's legal representatives. This is an important distinction. A civil settlement is not the same as a criminal conviction. It means the parties resolve the matter outside court, which can happen for various reasons: legal strategy, cost considerations, avoiding prolonged litigation, and does not necessarily imply guilt or innocence. What followed was extensive media coverage that, in many cases, treated the allegations as established fact, despite the absence of criminal charges or conviction. This represents a significant departure from journalistic standards that typically maintain the presumption of innocence until legal conviction. The media narrative began shifting, and Michael Jackson's image, once universally celebrated, became increasingly contested. The allegations received far more coverage than his humanitarian work or his artistic contributions. Simultaneously, Michael Jackson's music continued to dominate commercially. Bad, released in 1987, was enormously successful. Dangerous, released in 1991, continued his commercial dominance. He remained one of the most streamed, purchased, and influential artists in the world. Yet the cultural conversation about him was changing. Media coverage became increasingly focused on his personal life, his appearance, his relationships, and the unproven allegations, while his artistic and humanitarian work received less prominent attention. In 2003, nearly a decade later, another serious allegation emerged. A teenager claimed that Michael Jackson had engaged in inappropriate behavior. This time, criminal charges were actually filed. Michael Jackson went to trial in 2005. The trial lasted several months. Extensive evidence was presented by both the prosecution and the defense. Multiple witnesses testified, and crucially, on June 13, 2005, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all counts. The jury found him not guilty on every charge. 10 counts of child molestation, 4 counts of administering alcohol to facilitate molestation, and 2 counts of conspiracy. This is a matter of legal record, not opinion. The acquittal was significant because it meant that in a court of law, with due process protections, with evidence presented by both sides, with legal expertise involved, a jury determined that the prosecution had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the highest standard of proof in the legal system. Yet the media's response to the acquittal was remarkably subdued compared to the intense coverage of the trial itself. The narrative shifted from Jackson goes to trial to questions remain about Jackson, effectively treating the legal exoneration as irrelevant to public perception. What also went underreported was the analysis of evidence. The defense presented testimony suggesting that the accuser's family had financial motivation and a history of attempted extortion against other celebrities. Expert witnesses testified about inconsistencies in the accuser's account. Yet these details received minimal mainstream coverage. The media narrative had already been established, and the trial's outcome didn't substantially alter it. This represents a failure of journalistic responsibility to accurately report legal proceedings and their outcomes. It's important to acknowledge that acquittal does not necessarily mean innocence in the court of public opinion, and reasonable people can interpret evidence differently. However, in a society governed by rule of law, legal acquittal carries significant weight. Michael Jackson was denied this recognition in mainstream media discourse. Instead, the narrative became that questions remained, despite a jury's determination that guilt had not been proven. This inconsistency holding Michael Jackson to a different standard than other public figures. Something important about how media narratives operate independent of legal reality. The period following Michael Jackson's 2005 acquittal was marked by significant changes in how his work was treated in the commercial and cultural spheres. While he remained commercially viable, his albums continued to sell. His concerts continued to draw audiences. There was a discernible shift in how the music industry, media outlets, and cultural institutions approached his legacy. Radio stations that had previously maintained his music in regular rotation began reducing airplay. Streaming services, as they emerged, made decisions about playlist inclusion and algorithm prioritization that affected his visibility. Award shows that had celebrated him in previous decades became noticeably less likely to acknowledge his achievements. This marginalization was not uniformly documented or explicitly stated, but it was observable across multiple industries simultaneously. This pattern suggests systemic decisions rather than organic cultural shifts. When a single artist experiences simultaneous reduction in radio play, reduced streaming visibility, decreased award recognition, and diminished cultural presence across multiple independent platforms, it indicates coordinated industry response rather than coincidental changes. The mechanisms of this coordination varied, some explicit, some implicit, but the result was consistent. Michael Jackson's cultural presence was being systematically reduced. Younger generations, born after the mid-1990s, experienced Michael Jackson primarily through a filtered lens. They didn't grow up hearing his music dominate radio. They didn't experience his concert performances in real time. They didn't absorb his humanitarian work as contemporary news. Instead, they encountered Michael Jackson mainly through documentary content, often presented by media outlets with clear editorial perspectives. This generational divide in direct cultural experience meant that younger audiences' understanding of Michael Jackson was shaped almost entirely by media narratives rather than by his actual body of work or documented humanitarian contributions. Simultaneously, Michael Jackson's humanitarian work continued, though it received minimal mainstream attention. He funded education initiatives in Africa. He supported children's hospitals and medical research. He donated to disaster relief efforts. He maintained genuine concern for vulnerable populations, particularly children facing poverty and disease. This work was documented and verifiable, yet it occupied almost no space in mainstream media narratives about him. The selective attention to certain aspects of his life while ignoring others represents a fundamental failure of balanced journalism. The documentary landscape also shifted. Living with Michael Jackson, a 2003 documentary by Martin Bashir, presented footage that was later recognized as selective and misleading. It contributed to the negative narrative surrounding Jackson despite his eventual legal acquittal. This documentary influenced public perception significantly and demonstrated how editorial choices in documentary filmmaking could shape understanding of events and individuals. The power of visual media to create narrative even when that narrative is disputed by legal proceedings or contradicted by Evansby, came increasingly apparent. During this period, Michael Jackson's personal struggles also became more visible. He battled various health issues. He struggled with the effects of years of intense scrutiny and media attention. He faced financial challenges, despite his historical wealth, partly due to expensive legal battles, and partly due to business decisions. These difficulties were real and documented, but they were often presented in media coverage in ways that suggested they resulted from personal failings rather than from systemic pressures and coordinated narrative attacks. The distinction matters because it affects how audiences understand causation and responsibility. By the mid-2000s, a significant portion of the global population's understanding of Michael Jackson had been substantially shaped by allegations, accusations, and speculation often presented with minimal engagement with counter-evidence or legal outcomes. Meanwhile, his actual artistic legacy is revolutionary contributions to music, dance, visual art, and popular culture was increasingly treated as secondary to discussions of his personal life. This inversion of priorities represents a fundamental shift in how cultural figures are evaluated and remembered, rather than being remembered primarily for their contributions. Michael Jackson was being increasingly remembered primarily for allegations against him, regardless of legal determinations. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, at age 50. The official cause was cardiac arrest resulting from acute propofol intoxication, compounded by other medications. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, had been administering propofol, a powerful anesthetic typically used in surgical settings as a sleep aid in Jackson's home. This practice was highly unusual and represented a serious medical error. Dr. Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in 2011 and lost his medical license. The circumstances were tragic and reflected extremely poor medical judgment. Significantly, Jackson had been planning a major comeback. He had secured a contract to perform 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London titled, "This Is It." The shows sold out rapidly. Industry projections suggested the comeback would be enormously successful commercially and would likely have substantially altered Jackson's cultural standing. His return to performing at the highest level would have provided an opportunity for audiences to reconnect with his artistry directly, potentially reshaping how he was perceived after years of marginalization. The timing of Jackson's death, just as his comeback was being finalized, prevented this narrative shift from occurring. Whether this timing was consequential or coincidental, the effect was that Jackson was removed from the public stage at a moment when his influence could have been substantially rebuilt. His death became the final chapter of a narrative that had been written by others, rather than a chapter he could have written himself through his artistry and presence. The media response to Jackson's death was complex. Initial coverage acknowledged his status as an extraordinary artist and entertainer. His death was treated as a significant cultural event. However, even in the immediate aftermath, mainstream media coverage could not resist revisiting the accusations against him. Major news outlets, in their coverage of his death, felt compelled to mention the allegations, the 1993 settlement, the 2005 trial, and the acquittal on presenting these elements in ways that suggested ongoing controversy. Despite the legal determinations, the narrative even after death remained contested rather than allowing for uncomplicated acknowledgement of his artistic achievements. The commercial aftermath of Jackson's death was substantial. His music catalog became increasingly valuable. Previously suppressed or forgotten recordings were released. Concert documentaries were compiled and distributed. His image rights became actively managed commodities. His likeness was used in various commercial projects. In death, Michael Jackson became more economically valuable to the entertainment industry than he had been in life. However, this economic value was extracted under conditions where his reputation could not recover, where his artistic vision could not direct how his legacy was presented, and where narrative control remained entirely in the hands of corporate entities and media organizations. In 2019, a decade after Jackson's death, the Netflix documentary Leaving Neverland was released. It featured two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, making detailed allegations about abuse they claimed to have experienced decades earlier. The documentary presented their accounts without substantial counter-evidence. From Jackson's perspective, a limitation inherent in documenting allegations against a deceased person. The documentary was widely promoted and received significant media attention. Major news outlets treated it as definitive proof of guilt, despite its presentational limitations and despite the contested nature of some claims presented. Critical examination of Leaving Neverland reveals several significant issues. Both accusers had previously testified under oath during the 2005 trial, with one testifying that Jackson had not behaved inappropriately and the other being unavailable to testify. Their subsequent allegations, presented a decade after Jackson's death, differed substantially from their previous legal testimony. Additionally, some timeline claims in the documentary were disputed by independent facts. The documentary presented one perspective without adequate contextualization of these complicating factors, yet it was treated in mainstream media as conclusive evidence, effectively overriding the legal acquittal and presenting new allegations. As established fact, the true story of Michael Jackson requires us to ask difficult questions about how narratives are constructed, how evidence is evaluated, and how media institutions shape collective understanding. It requires distinguishing between allegations and proof, between speculation and evidence, between journalistic integrity and sensationalism. Michael Jackson faced serious allegations. This is documented fact. He was also acquitted in criminal court on all charges. This is also a documented fact. Both truths must coexist in any honest examination of his life. The mechanisms through which his reputation was managed to reveal important lessons about power and media. When allegations emerged, they received extensive coverage. When he was acquitted, the coverage was substantially less prominent. When new allegations emerged after his death when he could not respond or defend himself, they were presented with minimal skepticism despite their timing and despite complicating factors that deserved attention. This pattern suggests that media coverage responded to interests beyond simple truths. Whether those interests were commercial, ideological, or based on genuine beliefs about his guilt, the effect was the same. Narratives were constructed and promoted selectively. It's important to acknowledge legitimate concerns about Jackson's behavior. His relationships with children, while he maintained were innocent, were inappropriate by any reasonable standard. He shared beds with children who were not his own, a practice he defended but which violated reasonable boundaries. He gave expensive gifts to children. He created situations that, regardless of intent, placed him in positions where accusations could easily emerge. His judgment in these areas was genuinely poor, and this poor judgment created vulnerabilities that were inevitably exploited. This acknowledgement doesn't require accepting all accusations as true, but it does require recognizing that Jackson's behavior in certain areas was problematic and created legitimate concerns. Simultaneously, it's also important to acknowledge that accusers have financial incentives, that some allegations have been contradicted by previous testimony, that media narratives have been selective in what evidence they present, and that Jackson was entitled to the presumption of innocence and due process protections that were inadequately honored in mainstream discourse. The complexity here is genuine. It's not resolved by simply accepting all accusations or by dismissing all concerns. It requires intellectual honesty about nuance and contradiction. The broader question is about how media institutions function and whose interests they serve. When coverage is selective, when evidence is presented one-sidedly, when legal outcomes are treated as irrelevant to public narrative, when a deceased person cannot respond to accusations, when documentaries present allegations without adequate counter-evidence. What is the responsibility of media institutions? Do they serve truth-seeking or narrative control? Do they apply consistent standards or selective standards? These questions matter not just for Michael Jackson, but for how public figures are treated, how allegations are handled, and how collective understanding is shaped. Michael Jackson's humanitarian work deserves acknowledgement. He funded education in developing nations. He supported children's hospitals. He advocated for environmental protection and international peace. He donated hundreds of millions to charitable causes. These contributions were real and significant, regardless of questions about his personal behavior. A complete understanding of his life must include both his genuine humanitarian work and his genuine behavioral problems. Neither cancels the other. Both are true. The 2026 examination of Michael Jackson's story, presented with genuine intellectual rigor, reveals a complex human being, someone extraordinarily talented, artistically and deeply troubled personally, someone who contributed meaningfully to global humanitarian efforts and made seriously poor judgments about personal relationships, someone whose legal acquittals were not adequately honored by media institutions that had already constructed competing narratives, someone whose death removed the possibility of narrative correction or personal response, someone whose legacy continues to be managed by interests that may not align with complete truth. What emerges is not vindication or condemnation, but understanding. Understanding that truth is often complex and contradictory. Understanding that media narratives serve interests beyond truths. Understanding that allegations deserve investigation but also due process protections. Understanding that legal determinations matter even when they contradict public perception. Understanding that complete stories are more important than simplified ones. Understanding that Michael Jackson's flawed, talented, complicated, generous, troubled, Brilliant deserves to be remembered with intellectual honesty rather than simplified judgment, and understanding that how we remember him reflects how we think about power, media, evidence, and truth in our society.